Picture yourself at a lavish dinner party, crystal chandeliers casting shadows over plates worth more than your monthly rent. Before dessert arrives, one careless remark from the CEO's wife about someone only being good at making PowerPoints pretty ignites a chain of events that becomes the upset of the century. And the woman they dismissed most at that table, someone they thought only knew how to make things look nice, turned that dinner into the beginning of a $39 million reckoning. My name is Amelia Cross. And at 34, I'd spent the last decade orchestrating billion-dollar deals at Westbrook Advisory. That October evening at Maison Aurel should have been a celebration. We'd just secured Northvale Dynamics, a 3-year contract worth $39 million. Instead, it became the moment everything changed. The private dining room gleamed with old money elegance. I'd been strategically seated next to Clara Whitford, wife of Northvale's CEO Gerald. She wore diamonds that caught the light every time she lifted her wine glass, which was often, across from us, Evan Lowe, Northvale's newly appointed Director of Strategic Initiatives, held court with stories about his Harvard days. "So you're the one who puts together all those presentations," Clara said, turning to me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Gerald says you have quite the talent for making things look accessible." I smiled back, recognizing the tone. "Strategic visualization is part of it. Yes." "Oh, I'm sure it is." She laughed, a tinkling sound that drew her husband's attention. "It must be so satisfying, making all those PowerPoints pretty while the real strategic minds do the actual thinking." The table fell silent. My hand remained steady on my wine glass, though I felt every eye shift toward me. Gerald chuckled, a low, dismissive sound that gave his wife permission to continue. "I mean," Clara gestured with her fork, "it's important work, obviously. Someone has to translate all that complex strategy into something digestible, like a translator. But for pictures and graphs?" Evan leaned forward, sensing opportunity. "Clara makes an excellent point. The distinction between strategic execution and strategic thinking is crucial. At Northvale, we're very careful about keeping those lanes clear." He looked directly at me. "No offense, of course. Your slides are genuinely impressive." "None taken," I said, my voice perfectly neutral. I lifted my water glass in a mock toast to staying in our lanes. Martin Cole, my direct supervisor at Westbrook, shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. He was too focused on the contract and keeping the clients happy. Margaret Doyle, Northvale's senior vice president, watched the exchange with sharp eyes but remained silent. "You know," Clara continued, emboldened by the lack of pushback, "I was just telling Gerald that perhaps Northvale needs someone who understands both sides, the thinking and the presenting. Someone who can bridge that gap." She glanced at Evan. "Someone with fresh perspective." "Interesting thought," Gerald said, finally joining the conversation. "Evan, you mentioned you had some concerns about the current strategic framework." And there it was. The dinner wasn't just a celebration. It was an ambush. Evan launched into a critique of the 4 months of work I'd poured into the Northvale account, using words like overcomplicated and academically rigid. Every concern he raised was something I'd specifically addressed in my planning, but he presented them as if discovering fire. I memorized everything. The way Clara's fingers drummed against the table in satisfaction, Gerald's approving nods, Evan's rehearsed casualness as he dismantled my work, the way the other Westbrook executives avoided my eyes, even the waiter's embarrassed glance as he served the foie gras. Perhaps, Evan concluded, we need to revisit the entire approach. Start fresh with someone who understands Northvale's unique position. "Amelia." Martin finally spoke. "I'm sure you can work with Evan to incorporate his insights." I smiled, a real smile this time, because they had no idea what they'd just started. "Of course, I'm always happy to collaborate." The rest of the dinner passed in a blur of empty conversation and expensive wine. I participated when expected, laughed at the appropriate moments, even complimented Clara's jacket. But my mind was elsewhere, cataloging every detail, every weakness revealed in their arrogance. As we waited for dessert, Clara leaned close enough that I could smell her perfume, something French and excessive. No hard feelings, I hope. It's just business. I met her eyes directly. Just business. I agreed. The crème brûlée arrived, its caramelized surface perfect and unbroken. I tapped it with my spoon, watching the sugar shell crack into precise fragments. Sometimes the most satisfying destructions were the ones nobody saw coming. The next morning arrived with unseasonable frost on Boston's windows. I reached the office at 6:47 a.m., earlier than usual. But Evan Lowe was already there, standing in our conference room like he owned it. His tailored suit was perfectly pressed. His smile practiced as he arranged papers across the table. My papers, I noticed, but reorganized, simplified, dumbed down. Amelia, perfect timing. Martin called from the doorway. Evan's here to discuss the strategic realignment. Strategic realignment. Yesterday, it was my framework. Today, it needed realigning. The meeting that followed was a masterclass in corporate assassination. Evan had taken my 4 months of meticulous work, market analysis, risk assessments, growth projections, and reduced them to colorful slides with buzzwords. Synergy appeared 17 times. Disruptive innovation made 12 appearances. The actual data that supported our $39 million contract had been relegated to appendix material, too granular for executive consumption. The problem with the current approach, Evan explained, laser pointer dancing across his simplified charts, is that it assumes the client wants complexity, but what Northvale needs is clarity, vision, not spreadsheets. I watched him dismantle everything, noting which pieces he'd completely misunderstood and which he'd deliberately misrepresented. The Asia-Pacific expansion strategy I'd spent 3 weeks perfecting became a single bullet point. Explore Eastern markets. The risk mitigation framework that could save Northvale millions became maintain defensive posture. Amelia, Martin said when Evan finished. I trust you'll support Evan in implementing these adjustments. He'll be serving as our primary liaison with Northvale going forward. Of course, I replied, opening my laptop. I'll want to ensure proper documentation of all changes. For the record, Evan's smile flickered. That won't be necessary. We're streamlining, remember? Less paperwork, more action. Legal will need the trail, I said evenly. $39 million demands proper documentation. I'm sure you understand. Martin waved his hand dismissively. Fine, just don't slow things down. After they left, I sat alone in the conference room, staring at Evan's butchered presentation. Sophie Lane, one of my analysts, knocked quietly and entered. That was brutal, she said, closing the door behind her. Everyone knows that framework was bulletproof. Save everything, I told her. Every email, every draft, every timestamp. Create backups of the backups. Sophie's eyes widened with understanding. You're building a case. I'm preserving history. What happens to it later? I shrugged. That depends on how this plays out. Over the next 2 hours, I methodically documented every change Evan had made, creating a parallel file that showed the original strategy beside his simplification. Each alteration came with a risk score, what could go wrong, how much it could cost, who would be liable. By noon, I had 43 pages of potential disasters, all time-stamped, all traceable to this morning's meeting. Mark Torres from IT stopped by my office around lunch. Heard about the liaison change, he said carefully. Also heard you might need some help with archival redundancy. Hypothetically, I said, if someone were to modify shared drives without authorization, would there be logs? Everything leaves footprints, Mark replied. Even deletions, especially deletions. Interesting. That afternoon, Evan sent his first official email as liaison. Team, exciting news. Northvale loves the new streamlined approach. Gerald specifically mentioned how refreshing it is to work with someone who gets it, full steam ahead. I forwarded the email to my personal account, along with the previous 16 emails where Gerald had praised the complexity and thoroughness of the original framework. Then I responded to Evan with visible enthusiasm. Wonderful news! I've created a comprehensive changelog to track all improvements. Transparency is key to success. His response was almost immediate. No need for extra documentation. Let's stay agile. I smiled at my screen. Every refusal to document, every attempt to obscure the paper trail, it all went into my growing file. By the end of the day, I had enough evidence to show exactly how Evan was positioning himself to take credit while setting up the framework to fail. At 6 p.m., as the office emptied, I made one last backup of everything. Sophie had done the same. Mark had ensured our original files were locked in a revision history that couldn't be altered without triggering alerts. You know he's going to crash and burn, Sophie said as we walked to the elevator. Eventually, I agreed. The question is whether he takes the $39 million with him. And if he does? I pressed the elevator button, thinking of Clara's smug smile, Gerald's dismissive chuckle, Evan's practiced arrogance. Then we make sure everyone knows exactly who lit the match. The Thinking Cup coffee shop on Tremont Street opened at 5:30 a.m. Margaret Doyle was already waiting when I arrived, her silver hair catching the early morning light streaming through the windows. She'd chosen a corner table, back to the wall. Old habits from someone who'd survived 30 years of corporate warfare. "Amelia," she said, pushing a black coffee toward me. "You look like someone planning a revolution." "Just trying to save a $39 million contract," I replied, sitting down. Margaret laughed, short and sharp. "Please. We both know Evan Lowe couldn't strategize his way out of a paper bag. I've seen his type before, all presentation, no foundation, rather like his academic credentials. Actually," I kept my expression neutral, but Margaret caught the flicker of interest. "Oh, you didn't know?" She pulled out her phone, showing me a LinkedIn profile. "That Harvard MBA he keeps mentioning, executive education certificate, 6-week program. His actual degree is from a school that lost accreditation 3 years ago." "Interesting," I said carefully. "What's more interesting," Margaret continued, lowering her voice, "is that his last company, Pinnacle Consulting, folded 8 months after following his revolutionary, simplified strategy framework. Lost their biggest client, a pharmaceutical company, about $22 million in failed market expansion." She slid a folder across the table. Inside were news clippings, SEC filings, a particularly damning email thread that had been submitted as evidence in the resulting lawsuit. "Why are you showing me this?" I asked. Margaret stirred her coffee thoughtfully. "Because Gerald Whitford is on thin ice with our board. 3/4 of missed projections. The only thing keeping him in place was this new strategic partnership with Westbrook. Your framework, specifically. The board was impressed by the thoroughness, the risk mitigation strategies. And now? Now Gerald's letting his wife play CEO maker and bringing in a consultant with a questionable past to dismantle the very thing that bought him time." She met my eyes directly. "The board meets for quarterly review in 6 weeks. They'll want to see progress on the Asian market's expansion, the real strategy, not Evan's PowerPoint fiction." I understood immediately. You need the original framework intact. I need more than that. I need evidence that Gerald actively sabotaged a board-approved strategy to favor his wife's pet project. Margaret pulled out a second phone, a basic flip phone, the kind drug dealers used in crime shows. "If you were to hypothetically document every deviation from the approved plan, every ignored warning, every decision that puts that $39 million at risk." "Hypothetically," I said, taking the phone. "Such documentation would need to be comprehensive, time-stamped, irrefutable." "Hypothetically, it would. And if someone were to present such documentation at exactly the right moment, say, when Evan's simplification inevitably hits its first major snag, the board would need to act decisively to protect their investment." Margaret smiled, and for the first time, I saw why she'd survived 3 decades of corporate politics. Gerald thinks I'm just the diversity hire who aged into irrelevance. Clara thinks I'm furniture. And Evan? She chuckled. Evan doesn't even know I exist. Men like him never notice women over 50 unless they're bringing coffee. That's their weakness, I said. One of many. Margaret stood, leaving a 20 on the table. Keep the phone. Single number programmed in, text only, no calls. And Amelia? She paused at my shoulder. When this plays out, and it will play out, make sure you're positioned to catch what falls. It would be a shame if all that expertise in making things pretty went to waste. After she left, I sat for another 10 minutes, processing. Margaret wasn't just offering me revenge, she was offering me opportunity. The kind that came once in a career, if you were lucky, if you were smart, if you were willing to play the long game. I texted Sophie from my regular phone. Team meeting, my office, noon, bring Mark. Then I opened the burner phone and typed a single message. Understood. Documentation begins today. The response was immediate. Board meets December 15th. Quarterly financials due December 1st. Evan will likely make his move around Thanksgiving. Holidays hide mistakes. Thanksgiving. 6 weeks to document every disaster, build an irrefutable case, and position myself for whatever came next. I thought about Clara's condescending smile, about Gerald's dismissive chuckle, about Evan standing in our conference room like he'd already won. They thought they were playing checkers while I was organizing PowerPoints. They had no idea I'd been playing chess since the moment Clara called me a decorator with a laptop. I finished my coffee and headed back to the office. Time to start documenting the beginning of the end. Every email Evan sent, every meeting he bungled, every risk he ignored, it would all be preserved, organized, and ready to deploy. Margaret was right about one thing. It would be a shame to waste my expertise. But she was wrong about another. I wasn't just good at making things pretty. I was exceptional at making things clear. Crystal clear. Undeniably. Irrefutably clear. And in 6 weeks, everyone would see exactly that. The next 3 weeks became an exercise in calculated patience. Every morning, I arrived early to find Evan had already sent his daily innovation updates. Emails full of corporate buzzwords that systematically dismantled months of careful planning. I responded to each with enthusiasm, while secretly documenting every deviation from the approved strategy. Team Synergy Session in 5, Evan announced one Tuesday, bursting into our workspace. He'd taken to wearing designer glasses he didn't need, presumably to look more strategic. Sophie caught my eye and subtly started her phone's recording app. We'd developed a system. She handled audio. Mark managed digital trails, and I compiled everything into what we called the insurance file. So, Evan began, pulling up his latest slides. I've been thinking about the Asia-Pacific expansion. The original plan has us entering 3 markets simultaneously. But why complicate things? Let's focus on just Singapore. 1 market, 1 win, then we expand. The simultaneous entry was designed to hedge risks. I pointed out calmly. Singapore's regulatory environment is challenging. Japan and South Korea provide balance. See? That's the old thinking, Evan interrupted, pointing at me like I'd proved his point. Analysis paralysis. Gerald agrees. Better to move fast and break things. Mark typed furiously, capturing every word in our shared document. What about the currency hedging strategies? The 3-market approach protects against fluctuation. Details. Evan waved dismissively. We'll figure it out as we go. Agility, people, agility. After he left, Sophie pulled up the risk assessment I'd created months earlier. Singapore-only approach increases exposure by 47%. If the Monetary Authority changes regulations, which they're considering, according to your research, we could lose $12 million in the first quarter alone. Add it to the file, I said. Include the email where I warned him about the regulatory review. The one he replied, noted to? That's the one. By week 4, the insurance file had grown to 127 pages. Evan had ignored 38 specific warnings, dismissed 22 risk factors, and made 11 decisions that directly contradicted board-approved strategies. each one meticulously documented, time-stamped, and backed up in 3 locations. The burner phone buzzed regularly with updates from Margaret, bored getting nervous about Q4 projections. Then, Gerald promised them preliminary Asia numbers by Thanksgiving. And finally, Evans presenting his Singapore plan November 23rd. Board meeting December 15th. November 23rd, the day before Thanksgiving, when most people would be distracted by travel and turkey, when mistakes could be buried in holiday chaos, when no one would be paying attention, except I was paying attention. He's moving the timeline up, Sophie said, showing me Evan's latest email. Wants to launch Singapore before year-end. Tax advantages, he says. I pulled up the regulatory calendar. The Monetary Authority of Singapore announces new foreign investment rules December 1st. If he launches before knowing what they are, it could invalidate everything, Mark finished. Every contract, every partnership agreement. How much would that cost? Sophie asked. I did the math quickly. Best case, $6 million in restructuring. Worst case, we lose Singapore entirely. $20 million minimum. And he knows about the announcement? I showed them the email I'd sent 2 weeks prior, highlighting the regulatory timeline, with Evan's response, "Thanks for the heads up. Speed is more important than perfect information." Mark whistled low. He actually put that in writing? He put everything in writing, I said. Men like Evan always do. They're so confident in their own brilliance, they want it documented. That night, I stayed late, compiling a special subset of the insurance file, just the Singapore disaster. 15 pages of warnings ignored, risks dismissed, regulations overlooked, each page annotated with potential costs, legal implications, and the names of board members who would be personally liable if it went wrong. The burner phone buzzed. Heard Evans moving up timeline. Board not informed. Gerald covering for him. I typed back, documentation complete. Singapore alone could cost $20 million if launched before December 1st regulations. Board member Jennifer Walsh has $16 million personally invested. She won't be happy. Jennifer Walsh, I knew that name. Former SEC investigator, zero tolerance for financial incompetence. If she saw what Evan was about to do. One more thing. Margaret's next message read, Clara's been spreading rumors about redundancies in strategic planning. Your name was mentioned. So they weren't just trying to sideline me, they were planning to eliminate me entirely. Take credit for my work, then cut me loose before the disaster hit. Classic move. Also a fatal mistake. I opened a new document and began typing. Risk assessment, Singapore market entry, pre-regulatory announcement. Dry title, explosive content. Every single way Evan's plan could fail, with probability percentages and dollar amounts. The kind of document that would give Jennifer Walsh nightmares. At the bottom, I added a single line. Original strategic framework available upon request, including mitigation strategies for all identified risks. Sophie texted me at midnight. You're still at the office? Almost done, I replied. Just making things pretty. Because that's what I did. According to Clara, I made things pretty. Pretty clear. Pretty damning. Pretty impossible to ignore. The Northvale boardroom on November 23rd smelled like leather and impending disaster. I sat 3 seats from the head of the table, positioned perfectly to see everyone's faces when the walls came tumbling down. Evan stood at the presentation screen, confident as a televangelist, completely unaware that Margaret had insisted I attend to support the transition. Ladies and gentlemen, Evan began, his designer glasses catching the light. Today marks a pivotal moment for Northvale's Asian expansion. Simplified, streamlined, singular focus. Gerald beamed from his CEO chair. Clara sat in the observer section, wearing a smile that probably cost as much as her jewelry. Jennifer Walsh, however, was reading something on her tablet, her expression darkening with each swipe. Singapore represents our beachhead, Evan continued, clicking through his sparse slides. One market, complete dominance, then systematic expansion. We launched December 1st. December 1st? Jennifer Walsh's voice cut through his flow. That's 8 days from now. Speed is essential, Evan replied smoothly. First mover advantage. Mr. Lowe, Jennifer continued, not looking up from her tablet. Are you aware the Monetary Authority of Singapore announces new foreign investment regulations on December 1st? The room temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Preliminary research suggested. Evan faltered, looking at Gerald for support. Perhaps, Margaret said quietly. We should review the risk assessment. What risk assessment? Gerald asked, his confidence evaporating. Margaret nodded to me. I stood, my prepared folder already open. The comprehensive risk assessment submitted November 10th, November 15th, and November 20th, each one highlighting the regulatory announcement and its potential impact on early market entry. I haven't seen any, Gerald began. They were sent to Mr. Lowe as primary liaison, I said evenly, pulling out printed emails. His responses indicated he'd reviewed them thoroughly. Jennifer Walsh held up her tablet. Is this the assessment, the one that projects a $20 million loss if we enter before knowing the regulations? Every board member suddenly had their tablets out. Margaret had sent them the insurance file subset 10 minutes before the meeting. Perfect timing for them to read it while Evan was setting up his presentation. Those are worst-case scenarios, Evan said, his voice climbing. Pessimistic projections. Based on historical data from 16 similar regulatory changes, I interrupted, pulling up my original framework on my laptop, which Mark had wirelessly connected to the room's secondary screen. The Monetary Authority has increased foreign investment restrictions in 12 of those 16 cases. Our contingency plan, outlined in the original strategy, involves parallel entries in Japan and South Korea to offset potential Singapore delays. The plan Mr. Lowe removed, Margaret added helpfully. Streamlined, Evan corrected desperately. We streamlined it for efficiency. You streamlined us into a $20 million liability. Jennifer Walsh's voice could have frozen fire. Mr. Whitford, were you aware of these risks? Gerald's mouth opened and closed like a fish drowning in air. Clara had gone pale, her expensive smile nowhere to be found. Perhaps, board member David Liu suggested, we should see the original framework, the complete version. I clicked to the full presentation. 4 months of work displayed in perfect clarity. Market analysis, risk mitigation, regulatory calendars, currency hedging, local partnerships. Everything Evan had stripped away revealed itself as essential, interconnected, vital. This is impressive, Jennifer said, studying the screens. Who developed this? Amelia Cross, Margaret replied before anyone else could speak. Before Mr. Lowe's. Simplification. I need a moment with my board, Gerald managed, his CEO authority crumbling. Evan, please wait outside. Evan looked at me as he passed, recognition finally dawning. This wasn't happening to him. He'd done it to himself. I just made sure everyone could see it clearly. Ms. Cross, Jennifer Walsh called as I turned to leave. Please stay. We'll need someone who actually understands this framework. I sat back down, catching Clara's stricken expression. Her perfect dinner party ambush had become her husband's professional funeral. Let me be direct, Jennifer said once the door closed behind Evan. We're 8 days from a potential catastrophe. Can the original framework be salvaged? Yes, I replied simply. Every component still exists, documented and ready to implement. We can delay Singapore until January, launch Japan and South Korea as planned in December, and use the regulatory waiting period to strengthen local partnerships. Cost to correct course? $2 million in restructuring, primarily legal and logistics. The alternative is risking $20 million or more. David Liu laughed bitterly. $2 million to fix a $39 million disaster. Gerald, what were you thinking? I trusted my team's judgment, Gerald said weakly. You trusted your wife's dinner party gossip, Jennifer corrected, ice in every word. And nearly cost us everything. Margaret cleared her throat. I moved to restore the original strategic framework immediately, with Amelia Cross as direct report to the board for this project. Seconded, Jennifer said immediately. All in favor? David Liu asked. Every hand rose except Gerald's. But his didn't matter anymore. Ms. Cross, Jennifer turned to me. We'll need a full implementation timeline by Monday. Can you deliver? It's already prepared, I said, pulling out another folder. I anticipated we might need to move quickly. As the board members reviewed the recovery timeline, murmuring approval, I caught Margaret's eye. She gave the slightest nod, a promise that this was just the beginning. The meeting adjourned with Gerald still sitting frozen in his chair, Clara having fled sometime during the vote. Evan was nowhere to be found, probably already updating his resume, though the story of this disaster would follow him everywhere. Ms. Cross. Jennifer Walsh stopped me at the door. That was exceptionally well documented. Almost like you knew this would happen. I met her gaze directly. I just made the data pretty clear enough for everyone to understand. She smiled, sharp and knowing. Indeed. We'll be discussing your future with Northvale very soon. I suspect it will be significant. The aftermath moved faster than I'd anticipated. By Monday morning, Northvale had issued an internal memo restructuring strategic partnerships. Corporate speak for heads rolling. Evan Lowe's consulting contract had been terminated, effective immediately. Gerald remained CEO in title only. The board had stripped him of any decision-making power regarding the Asian expansion. Martin Cole called me into his office at 7 a.m., his face a masterclass in barely controlled panic. What the hell happened at Northvale? He demanded before I'd even sat down. Evan's simplified strategy had some gaps, I said mildly. The board noticed. Gaps? Martin's voice cracked. Jennifer Walsh called me personally. She said Evan nearly cost them $20 million. She said you prevented a disaster. I presented data. The board drew their own conclusions. Martin stood, pacing behind his desk. She also said Northvale is reconsidering their partnership with Westbrook, that they're questioning our judgment in supporting Evan's approach. I remained silent, letting him arrive at the inevitable conclusion himself. You documented everything, didn't you? His accusation came out as a whisper. Every meeting where I told you to support him, every email where I dismissed your concerns. Standard corporate practice, I replied. You taught me that my first year here. Cover your assets, remember? His face went from red to white. Amelia, we can work this out internally. There's no need to. To what? I interrupted, standing. To let Northvale know that Westbrook's leadership ignored multiple risk assessments, that you prioritized keeping Gerald happy over protecting a $39 million contract? You don't understand the politics. I understand perfectly. I placed a folder on his desk, not the insurance file, just a summary, enough to show him the scope of what I had. Northvale's board meets December 15th. They'll be making final decisions about partnerships. I suggest you consider carefully how Westbrook wants to be positioned. I walked to the door, then paused. Oh, and Martin, check your email. Legal forwarded something about potential liability in failed strategic advisement. Apparently, if Northvale had proceeded with Evan's plan and lost millions, Westbrook could have been sued for negligence. You're welcome for avoiding that. Back at my desk, Sophie and Mark were waiting with barely concealed excitement. 3 headhunters have called this morning, Sophie whispered. Word's out about what happened at Northvale. And Margaret Doyle's assistant scheduled a meeting for you tomorrow. Mark added, private breakfast, Boston Harbor Hotel. I smiled, but kept working. The game wasn't over yet. Gerald and Clara were wounded, but not finished, and wounded animals were the most dangerous. The answer came that afternoon in the form of a meeting request from Clara Whitford herself. Coffee tomorrow. We should clear the air. See. Sophie saw it over my shoulder. That's a trap. Obviously, I accepted the meeting anyway. That evening, I prepared carefully. Not the insurance file, that was for the board. Instead, I compiled something special for Clara. Every dismissive comment about my work from the past 6 months. Every email where she'd influenced Gerald's decisions. Every traceable connection between her suggestions and strategic failures. The burner phone buzzed. Gerald trying to blame everything on Evan. Board not buying it. Clara's been calling board members' wives. I typed back. Let her. December 15th is what matters. Agreed. BTW. Jennifer Walsh asking about your contract status. Interested? I stared at the message. A board member inquiring about my availability meant something bigger was in motion. My contract with Westbrook has standard non-compete clauses. I replied. Non-competes are harder to enforce when the company faces negligence claims. Just saying. The next morning, I met Clara at a deliberately public cafe. Witnesses were important. She looked like she'd aged 5 years in 5 days. Her designer armor slightly tarnished. You destroyed everything, she said without preamble. I presented data, I corrected. You destroyed everything when you decided I was just decoration. Evan was a tool you and Gerald used to push me aside, except you didn't vet him properly. His last company lost $22 million following his strategies. Did you know that when you recommended him? Her silence was answer enough. Here's what happens next, I continued, voice conversational. The board completes their review. They'll find that Gerald consistently ignored expert advice to follow personal preferences. They'll see how much those preferences cost, and they'll act accordingly. You vindictive little professional, I interrupted. The word you're looking for is professional. I protected a $39 million contract from amateur hour. That's my job. Clara leaned forward, desperation cracking her composure. What do you want? Money? A promotion? I want you to remember this moment, I said. Standing. The moment you realized the person you dismissed as just making things pretty had been playing chess while you were playing dress-up. Your husband's career, your social position, your influence, all hanging by a thread because you couldn't recognize competence when it was sitting right next to you at dinner. I left her there with the check, her perfect world crumbling into beautifully documented pieces. Martin would try to salvage Westbrook's reputation. Gerald would try to save his position. Clara would try to maintain her influence. They'd all fail. The documentation would ensure that. Clear, comprehensive, undeniable documentation. After all, I was exceptional at making things pretty clear. The Boston Harbor Hotel's private dining room commanded a view of the waterfront, fog rolling across the harbor like silk. Margaret Doyle had arrived early again, but this time she wasn't alone. Jennifer Walsh sat beside her, along with David Liu and 2 other board members I recognized from the meeting. Amelia. Margaret smiled, gesturing to an empty chair. Thank you for coming. Let's skip the pleasantries, Jennifer said, direct as always. The board has voted. Gerald Whitford will be stepping down December 31st. The announcement goes public December 16th, after our board meeting. I kept my expression neutral, though my pulse quickened. We need stability. David Liu continued. The Asian expansion can't afford more disruption. The original framework, your framework, has unanimous board support. We want to ensure its implementation. Westbrook can handle, I began. No. Jennifer interrupted. Westbrook can't. Martin Cole called me yesterday, trying to distance himself from the Evan Lowe disaster. He threw you under the bus, claimed you'd gone rogue, acted without authorization. I wasn't surprised, but the betrayal still stung. I see. We don't want Westbrook, Margaret said. We want you, specifically. We want cross-strategic solutions. I blinked. That doesn't exist. It could. Jennifer slid a folder across the table. Delaware Incorporation documents, prepared and ready. All you have to do is sign. I opened the folder, scanning the documents. They'd thought of everything: corporate structure, initial funding, even office space. The $39 million contract would transfer from Westbrook to your firm. David explained. Pending successful implementation of the Asian expansion, of course. My non-compete becomes void if Westbrook terminates you. Jennifer smiled. which Martin will do the moment he realizes we're pulling the contract. He'll try to make you the scapegoat. We're offering you a lifeboat before he pushes you overboard. Plus, Margaret added, we've already received interest from 3 other companies who want to work with whoever saved North Vale from a $20 million mistake. You wouldn't just have us as a client. I thought about 10 years at Westbrook, building my reputation, earning my position. Then I thought about Martin's cowardice, Clara's condescension, Evan's arrogance. They'd all tried to diminish me, to reduce me to window dressing. I'll need my team, I said. Sophie Lane, Mark Torres, and a few others. Done. Jennifer agreed immediately. We'd rather have people who recognize the disaster coming than those who enabled it. And Westbrook? We'll receive formal notice that we're reviewing all strategic partnerships, David said. Martin will understand the implication. He can either release you gracefully or fight it and have the full story become public. The full story, every documented failure, every ignored warning, every piece of evidence in the insurance file. Martin would release me. He had no choice. There's one condition, Margaret said. We need someone to present the recovery plan to the board on December 15th. Someone who understands every detail, every risk, every opportunity. Someone who can ensure the board that the $39 million is safe. You mean someone to stand where Gerald stood and explain how we're fixing his mistakes without making it look like a complete disaster, I translated. Exactly, Jennifer said. Can you do it? I thought about that dinner at Maison Aurel, Clara's dismissive laugh, Gerald's patronizing approval of Evan's destruction of my work. I thought about every meeting where my expertise was diminished, every moment my competence was questioned. Yes, I said. I can do it. Margaret smiled. Then sign the papers. Cross Strategic Solutions opens for business January 1st, with North Vale as your flagship client. I signed my name with the Mont Blanc pen Jennifer offered. Heavy, expensive, significant. With each signature, I felt the weight of what was happening. I wasn't just leaving Westbrook. I wasn't just taking their biggest client. I was taking my expertise, my reputation, and my team to build something entirely my own. Welcome to the real game, Jennifer said, shaking my hand. Oh, and Amelia? Clara Whitford has been calling board members' spouses, trying to salvage Gerald's position. You might want to prepare for that. I already have, I said, thinking of the secondary file I'd prepared documenting Clara's interference in corporate decisions. If she pushes, she won't like what pushes back. Good. Margaret stood. Because in 2 weeks, you'll be standing in front of the board as CEO of your own firm, presenting a strategy that will define North Vale's next decade. Make it count. As I left the hotel, the morning sun was burning through the fog. My phone showed 17 missed calls from Martin and 3 text messages that progressed from concerned to angry to desperate. I didn't respond. Instead, I texted Sophie and Mark. Meeting tonight, my apartment, bring champagne, we're going into business. Then I called the one person who deserved to hear it first, my mentor from my first year at Westbrook, long since retired. Patricia? It's Amelia. Remember when you told me the best revenge is massive success? I'm about to find out if you were right. The morning of December 15th arrived crisp and clear, Boston gleaming under winter sunshine. I stood in the North Vale boardroom where it had all begun, but this time I was at the head of the table. My new business cards read, Amelia Cross, CEO, Cross Strategic Solutions, still fresh from the printer. The board filed in, their faces showing mixture of anticipation and relief. Gerald's chair remained empty. He'd submitted his resignation 2 days earlier, effective immediately. Clara hadn't been seen at any corporate event since our coffee meeting. Ladies and gentlemen, I began, clicking to my first slide, the original framework, now enhanced with 3 weeks of refinement. The Asian expansion is not only salvageable, but positioned to exceed original projections. I walked them through everything: the recovery from Evan's simplification, the successful delay of Singapore entry, the early positive responses from Japanese and South Korean partners. The numbers told a story of disaster averted and opportunity seized. Current projection shows full recovery of the $2 million restructuring cost within Q1, I continued. With anticipated returns of $47 million by year-end, $8 million above original estimates. How? Jennifer Walsh asked, though her smile suggested she already knew. By using the Singapore delay strategically. While waiting for regulations, we've secured 3 additional partnerships that wouldn't have been available if we'd rushed entry. The very thing Evan saw as weakness, patience, and thorough planning became our strength. The room filled with approving murmurs. I clicked to my final slide, showing the Northvale logo alongside Cross Strategic Solutions. The full implementation timeline is in your packets, along with risk assessments, mitigation strategies, and contingency plans for every identified variable. Every decision point is documented, every assumption tested, every projection conservative. David Liu laughed. In other words, the opposite of what we've had for the past 2 months. I prefer to think of it as comprehensive strategic visualization, I said, allowing myself a small smile. Making complex things clear. Margaret stood. I moved to approve the framework as presented and confirm the contract transfer to Cross Strategic Solutions. Seconded, Jennifer added immediately. The vote was unanimous. As the board members gathered their papers, Jennifer approached me. That comment about making complex things clear, nice touch. Just doing what I do best, I replied. Making things pretty obvious. After the meeting, I found myself in the executive elevator with Margaret. She handed me an envelope. Inside was a printed email from Clara Whitford to her husband, sent the night of that fateful dinner. Make sure Evan gets Amelia's job. She's too smart for her own good. Why show me this now? I asked. Because success is the best revenge, but knowing your instincts were right from the beginning? That's satisfaction. The elevator opened to the lobby. Oh, and Amelia? 3 other companies have already called about your services. Seems saving $39 million makes an impressive calling card. I walked out of Northvale's building into the bright December afternoon. My phone buzzed with messages from Sophie, Mark, and the 6 other former Westbrook employees who'd joined Cross Strategic Solutions. We'd planned a celebration dinner at Maison Aurel, the same private room where it all began. The final message was from Clara. You destroyed our lives. I typed back, no, I just made the truth pretty clear. You destroyed yourselves. Then I deleted her number. Some things weren't worth keeping, even as trophies. That evening, sitting in the same chair where I'd been dismissed as decoration, I raised a glass of champagne with my new team. The contract was signed, the company launched, and the $39 million that should have been lost was instead projected to grow. To making things pretty, Sophie toasted, grinning. To making things pretty clear, I corrected, thinking of every slight, every dismissal, every moment they'd underestimated me. The waiter brought our dessert, crème brûlée, its surface perfect and unbroken. This time, when I cracked through the caramelized sugar, I savored every fragment. Sometimes the most satisfying destructions were the ones everyone saw coming, but only after it was too late to stop them. 6 months later, Forbes ran a profile. From PowerPoints to power moves, how Amelia Cross built a strategic consulting firm worth $100 million in 6 months. They asked me about the secret to my success. I told them the truth. I'm very good at making things look exactly like what they are. Sometimes that's pretty. Sometimes it's pretty devastating. The key is knowing which one the situation calls for. Clara Whitford wasn't quoted in the article. By then, she and Gerald had quietly relocated to their house in the Hamptons. Their influence in Boston's corporate circles completely dissolved. Evan Lowe was working as a junior analyst at a firm in Delaware. His LinkedIn no longer mentioned Harvard or strategic innovation. And me? I was signing my 5th major client, building a company that would eventually go public at a valuation that made that $39 million look like pocket change. All because one night at dinner, they thought I was just good at making things pretty. They were right. I was exceptional at it. Thank you so much for listening to this story of corporate revenge and sweet vindication. I'd love to know where you're listening from. Drop a comment below and let's connect. If you enjoyed this tale of strategic triumph, please subscribe to the channel and share your thoughts. What would you have done in Amelia's position? Let me know in the comments.